Sometimes a man runs to the mountains not to find himself, but to lose the parts of himself he can't live with. For 20 years, Levi Wilde had been doing just that in the high country above Cedar Ridge. The townsfolk below whispered about the old mountain man who disappeared after the war. Some said he was dead. Others said he'd gone mad with grief. They were both wrong and right. When 7 bounty hunters rode into town asking about old debts, they woke something the mountain had been keeping quiet. These hunters thought they were chasing down an aging hermit. Instead, they found a man who'd spent 2 decades learning that solitude doesn't heal all wounds. It just teaches you to carry them better. What happened next would leave Cedar Ridge speechless. How many trained killers can one mountain man survive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a prayer carved from pine and determination, tucked into a fold of granite where the morning sun couldn't reach until well past 8. Levi Wilde had built it with his own hands 20 years ago. Using timber he'd felled himself and stones he'd hauled from the creek bed below. Every log bore the mark of his axe, every chink filled with moss and mud he'd mixed by moonlight when sleep wouldn't come. He woke before dawn, as he had every morning since coming to this place. The ritual never changed. Coffee first, black as his thoughts, strong enough to wake the dead. Then the reading. His fingers found the worn leather spine of his Bible without looking, muscle memory guiding him to the book that had become both anchor and albatross. The pages fell open to Psalms, as they always did, and there, between verses 23 and 24, lay a pressed wildflower, purple mountain aster, faded now to the color of old bruises. He'd picked it the day after Mary and little Samuel were buried. The daguerreotype sat on the rough-hewn mantel, its silver surface catching what little light filtered through the single window. Levi didn't need to look at it to see the faces staring back. His wife's gentle smile, his boy's gap-toothed grin, his own younger face unmarked by the weight of what was to come. But he looked anyway, same as every morning, because forgetting would be a betrayal worse than remembering. "Morning, Mary," he whispered to the photograph. "Morning, son," the mountain answered with silence, as it always did. Outside, the world was waking up in shades of grey and gold. Mule deer picked their way through the aspen grove, their white tails flicking at shadows. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding thermals that wouldn't exist for another hour in the valley below. This was Levi's congregation now, creatures that asked nothing of him but his presence, offered nothing but the same in return. He dressed slowly, pulling on wool pants patched in a dozen places, a flannel shirt soft from washing in the creek, boots that had walked more miles than most men would travel in a lifetime. The holster came last, settled on his hip like an old friend returning from a long journey. The Colt Navy revolver had been with him since Shiloh, its grip worn smooth by hands that had learned to kill before they'd learned to love. Down in Cedar Ridge, folks were stirring too. He could see smoke rising from chimneys, thin ribbons against the morning sky. Sheriff Morrison would be making his rounds, checking doors and windows out of habit more than necessity. Doc Palmer would be brewing his own coffee, probably spiking it with something stronger if his hands were shaking again. And Helen Crawford would be opening her store, sweeping dust from the boardwalk while her grandson Tommy helped arrange the goods she couldn't afford to lose. Helen, the only person in 20 years who'd looked at him without fear or pity. She'd been married to Frank Crawford when Levi first came to these mountains, a young woman with kind eyes and a laugh that reminded him too much of Mary's. Frank had died of pneumonia 5 winters back, leaving her with a general store, a mountain of debt, and a grandson to raise. She'd never once asked Levi for help, but she'd never turned him away when he appeared at her back door with fresh meat or firewood. Tommy was 8 now, same age Samuel had been when Levi stopped that thought before it could take root. Some paths led nowhere but pain. The boy had his grandmother's eyes and his late father's stubborn streak. He wasn't afraid of Levi, which marked him as either very brave or very foolish. Last winter, when the snows came early and hard, Tommy had followed Levi's tracks up the mountain, determined to learn how to set snares for rabbits. Levi had found him half frozen and crying, but still clutching the rope he'd been practicing with. "My pa says you're the ghost of Shiloh," Tommy had said through chattering teeth as Levi carried him back toward town. "Your pa's got a big mouth." Levi had replied, "Are you really a ghost?" Levi had considered the question seriously, the way you did when a child asked. "Some days I reckon I am. Ghosts are supposed to be dead." "Son, there's more than one way to die." The boy had thought about that all the way home, his young mind wrestling with concepts too heavy for his years. Helen had been waiting on her porch, relief and anger warring on her face. She'd thanked Levi with words that meant more than they said, and he'd tipped his hat and disappeared back into the trees before the gratitude could settle too deep in his chest. That had been 6 months ago. Spring had come and gone, summer had burned itself out, and now autumn was painting the mountains in shades of fire and gold. The aspen leaves whispered secrets to each other when the wind blew, and sometimes Levi imagined they were telling him it was time to come down from his perch among the clouds. But coming down meant facing what he'd left behind, and what he'd left behind had teeth sharper than any mountain cat. The coffee finished brewing, filling the cabin with the smell of civilization and comfort. Levi poured himself a cup and stepped onto the rough porch he'd built from pine logs and stubborn will. The view stretched for miles in every direction, peaks and valleys, forests and meadows, a world painted in God's own colors. But his eyes always found their way to the thin line of smoke rising from Cedar Ridge's main street. He'd been to war. He'd seen men die in ways that haunted his sleep and poisoned his dreams. He'd killed more men than he cared to count, some with bullets, some with blades, some with his bare hands when ammunition ran low and mercy ran out. The uniform had given him permission, the cause had given him purpose, but the guilt had given him this exile. They'd called him the ghost of Shiloh because of how he moved through enemy lines, silent as smoke and twice as deadly. His commanding officer had been Captain Ezra Kane, a man with ice-blue eyes and a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Kane had seen potential in the quiet farm boy from Tennessee, had shaped him into something harder and colder than the mountain granite. But even ghosts could be haunted, and Kane's ghost had been chasing Levi for 20 years. The sound came from below, carried on the morning wind like a whisper of trouble. Gunshots, 3 of them, spaced apart like a man testing his weapon. Then silence, heavy and waiting. Levi set down his coffee cup and listened. The forest had gone quiet, the way it did when something wrong entered its borders. Even the hawk had stopped circling, more shots. These ones rapid, desperate. The sound of men fighting for their lives. He moved back into the cabin, muscle memory guiding him to the gun rack mounted on the far wall. The rifle was a Sharps .50 caliber, accurate at ranges that would make most men weep. He'd modified the trigger himself, filed the sights until they were perfect, carved the stock to fit his shoulder like a missing piece of his soul. The ammunition went into his coat pocket. The knife went into his boot. The small derringer went up his sleeve, held in place by a spring mechanism he'd fashioned from watch parts. Through the window, Cedar Ridge looked peaceful enough. But Levi had learned not to trust appearances. Peace was often just violence taking a breath. He should stay put. That had been the agreement he'd made with himself 20 years ago. Let the world solve its own problems, while he wrestled with his own demons in private. But as he watched, more smoke began rising from the town below. Not the thin ribbons of morning fires, but the thick black smoke that meant trouble. Helen was down there. Tommy, too. Levi checked his weapons one more time and started down the mountain. The trail was steep and treacherous, carved by deer and improved by 20 years of Levi's boots. He moved carefully but quickly, rifle at the ready, eyes scanning for signs of whatever had disturbed the morning's peace. The forest whispered around him, branches reaching like fingers, shadows dancing at the edge of his vision. Halfway down, he found horse tracks. 7 riders moving fast and hard up the valley road. The prints were fresh, made within the last hour. One of the horses was favoring its left front hoof, an old injury that had never healed quite right. Levi knew that print. He'd seen it at Vicksburg, at Cold Harbor, at a dozen battlefields where good men had died for causes they'd never understand. The horse had belonged to Captain Ezra Kane's favorite mount, a bay gelding with more heart than sense, which meant Kane was here. After 20 years of silence, the war had finally come to Cedar Ridge. The daguerreotype seemed to burn in his memory as he quickened his pace. Mary's face, Samuel's laugh, the life he'd lost because he'd been too busy serving his country to protect his family. The border raiders had come in the night, while he was away on another of Kane's missions, leaving nothing but ashes and graves, and a guilt that had driven him to these mountains. But if Kane thought he could ride into Levi's world and start shooting, the man had another think coming. The ghost of Shiloh was about to wake up. The seventh man was standing beside the horses, a nervous-looking fellow with twitchy eyes and hands that kept drifting toward his guns. He had the look of a man who'd seen too much killing and not enough mercy. The kind who jumped at shadows and shot first at everything else. Levi studied him from the cover of a water trough, noting the way he favored his left leg, an old wound that hadn't healed quite right. The man's attention kept shifting between the store and the mountain slopes, but he was missing the most dangerous ground, the space right behind him, moving like smoke. Levi slipped from shadow to shadow until he was close enough to smell the man's fierce sweat. The knife came out of his boot in one smooth motion, and before the sentry could draw breath to shout, Levi's hand was over his mouth and the blade was sliding between his ribs, angled up toward the heart. "Shh," Levi whispered as the man sagged against him. "It's almost over." He lowered the body behind the water trough and took the dead man's rifle, checking the action and the ammunition. 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but it would have to do. From inside the store, Kane's voice carried clearly, 45 minutes, Wilde. The boy's looking a little pale. I'd hate for him to faint from the suspense. Levi moved to the store's back entrance, testing the door handle with fingers that remembered every lock and latch in Cedar Ridge. Helen never locked her back door during business hours, said it wasn't neighborly. Today, that small kindness might save her life. The door opened silently on hinges Levi had oiled himself just last winter. He slipped inside, finding himself in the store's cramped storage room, among barrels of flour and sacks of beans. Through the curtained doorway, he could hear Kane pacing, his boots clicking against the wooden floor, like a clock counting down to doomsday. "You know what I remember most about Shiloh?" Kane was saying, his voice taking on the lecturing tone he'd used when giving tactical briefings. "The way you moved through those Confederate lines, like you were part of the morning mist. Silent, deadly, gone, before anyone knew you'd been there." Levi eased the curtain aside just enough to get a clear view of the store's interior. Kane stood near the front window, still watching the mountains. 4 of his men were positioned around the room. 1 by the front door, 1 by the counter where Helen and Tommy waited, 2 more flanking the broken window. Professional positioning. These weren't just hired guns. They were soldiers who remembered their training, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They were all watching the front of the store. "I taught you everything you knew about killing," Kane continued. "How to read the wind, how to judge distance, how to put a bullet exactly where you wanted it. But I never taught you the most important lesson of all." He turned from the window, and Levi saw the madness that had been lurking behind those ice-blue eyes for 20 years. Kane wasn't just angry or vengeful, he was broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. "I never taught you that some ghosts need to stay dead." The Silver Star medal on Kane's chest caught the morning light streaming through the window. It was the same decoration Levi had seen him wear during the war, back when they'd both believed in causes larger than themselves. Now it looked like a tombstone marker, commemorating the death of whatever honor Kane had once possessed. "Tell me, Mrs. Crawford," Kane said, turning his attention back to Helen. "What stories do they tell about our ghost? Do they say he was a hero? A patriot fighting for the glorious cause?" Helen's voice shook but held steady. "Folks don't talk much about the past around here." Kane laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Oh, but they should. They should know what kind of man they've been harboring all these years. The ghost of Shiloh wasn't just a sniper, you see. He was an executioner. Levi's grip tightened on the stolen rifle. Through the curtain gap, he could see Tommy's face, pale but defiant, his young eyes burning with the kind of anger that could either save a man or destroy him. Captain Kane, one of the men by the window, said quietly, "Movement on the ridge line." Kane spun toward the window, his hand dropping to his gun. "Where?" "Gone now. Might have been a deer, or might have been our ghost getting restless." Kane smiled, that cold, cutting smile Levi remembered too well. "Sergeant Briggs, take Morrison and check the back of the store. Our friend might try to get creative." Levi had perhaps 30 seconds before they discovered the storage room. He made his choice quickly, stepping through the curtain with the rifle raised and ready. "Hello, Ezra?" The room exploded into motion. Kane's men were well-trained, but Levi had the advantage of surprise and 20 years of mountain-honed reflexes. His first shot took the man by the counter-center mass, spinning him away from Helen and Tommy. His second caught the soldier by the door as the man was turning, the bullet punching through his neck in a spray of crimson. Kane dove behind a display case, shouting orders to his remaining men. The two by the window were already moving, one toward the back room, the other trying to get an angle on Levi's position. But Levi wasn't there anymore. He'd rolled behind the counter, using Helen's cash register as cover while he worked the rifle's action. "3 rounds left! Get down!" he shouted to Helen and Tommy, and both of them dropped to the floor behind the counter's solid oak bulk. Kane's voice rose over the gunfire. "You always were too sentimental, Wilde. That's why you'll lose." A bullet splintered the wood inches from Levi's head, showering him with splinters. He popped up long enough to send his third shot toward the window, driving the shooters back into cover. 2 rounds left. The man heading for the back room had reached the curtained doorway, his rifle trained on the space where Levi crouched. For a heartbeat, their eyes met across 20 feet of gunsmoke and spilled merchandise. Levi's 4th shot took him in the chest, but the man got his own trigger pulled before he fell. The bullet sang past Levi's ear and punched through a sack of flour, filling the air with white dust. 1 round left, and Kane was still alive. "You want to know what really happened at Milliken's Bend?" Kane called out, his voice echoing from somewhere behind the overturned display case. "Ask your ghost about the prisoners, Mrs. Crawford. Ask him about the 20 Confederate boys who tried to surrender." Helen's face had gone white, but her eyes remained steady. She pulled Tommy closer, shielding him with her body. "Don't listen to him," Levi said quietly. "The man's been crazy for 20 years, but Kane wasn't finished. Tell her, Wilde. Tell her how you lined them up against the church wall and put a bullet in each of their heads." The remaining soldier by the window was trying to work his way around for a flanking shot, but Levi could track his movement by the creak of floorboards. When the man appeared at the counter's edge, rifle swinging toward Helen and Tommy, Levi used his last bullet. The silence that followed was deafening. Kane rose from behind the display case, his fancy Colt in his hand, pointed directly at Levi's chest. "Empty?" Levi said nothing, his own rifle useless now but still held ready. "I thought so." Kane stepped over the body of one of his men, his boots squelching in blood that was already soaking into the wooden floor. "You always were predictable, Wilde. Effective, but predictable. Let them go, Ezra. This is between you and me." Kane glanced at Helen and Tommy, both still crouched behind the counter, then back at Levi. "But that's where you're wrong, old friend. This stopped being about you and me the day you destroyed my life with your testimony." The madness in Kane's eyes was complete now. A fire that had been burning for 20 years and finally found enough fuel to consume everything around it. He kept the gun trained on Levi, but addressed his words to Helen. "Your ghost was my best killer, Mrs. Crawford. I created him, shaped him, turned him from a farm boy into an instrument of death. And then he betrayed me." "I told the truth," Levi said quietly. "You told lies." Kane's voice cracked like a whip. "You said I ordered the execution of those prisoners when you know damn well you made that decision on your own." The lie was so brazen, so complete in its reversal of reality, that for a moment Levi could only stare. Cain had twisted the truth so thoroughly in his own mind that he actually believed it. "I remember what happened," Levi said. "Every detail, every face. Do you? Or do you remember what you told yourself to justify what you'd become?" Cain took another step closer, the gun never wavering. "Those boys were trying to surrender, yes. But you saw Confederate uniforms, and you saw the faces of the men who killed your family. So you lined them up and you shot them down like dogs. That's not... And when the investigators came asking questions, you threw me under the wagon to save your own skin. Blamed your commanding officer for your own bloodlust." The store had gone silent, except for Cain's voice, and the distant sound of Doc Palmer calling for help from somewhere outside. Through the broken window, Levi could see more townspeople gathering, but they were keeping their distance. "Smart of them. Here's what's going to happen," Cain continued. "You're going to confess. Here now, in front of witnesses. You're going to tell Mrs. Crawford and her grandson exactly what kind of monster they've been protecting." He shifted his aim slightly, now pointing the gun at Tommy's head. "Or I'm going to paint these walls with the boy's brains." Helen made a sound like a prayer being strangled, but she didn't move, didn't break. The woman had more steel in her spine than most men Levi had known. Tommy looked up at Levi with eyes that held no fear, only curiosity. "Mr. Levi, are you really the ghost of Shiloh?" The question hung in the gun smoke and morning light, simple and direct, in the way only a child's question could be. Levi met the boy's gaze and saw something there that reminded him powerfully of his own son, that mixture of innocence and understanding, that ability to see straight through to the heart of things. "Yes, son," Levi said quietly. "I am. Did you kill those soldiers?" Cain's finger tightened on the trigger, but he waited for the answer. This was what he'd come for, not just Levi's death, but his complete destruction. His confession in front of the people who'd shown him kindness. Levi looked at the boy, at Helen, at the wreckage of the store that had been a sanctuary of sorts. Then he looked at Cain, and in those mad blue eyes he saw his own future. 20 more years of running, of hiding, of letting the past poison every moment of the present. "Yes," he said. "I killed them." Cain smiled in triumph, but Levi wasn't finished. "Your captain ordered their execution. I followed orders, and I've been paying for it ever since." The smile vanished from Cain's face. "You lying—" The derringer slipped from Levi's sleeve into his palm, the spring mechanism working exactly as he'd designed it. The tiny gun held only 2 shots, but at this range, 1 would be enough. Cain saw the weapon and tried to swing his own gun around, but 20 years of soft living had slowed his reflexes. Levi's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him sideways and sending his Colt skittering across the floor. Cain fell hard, clutching his wounded shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers. "You son of a bitch!" Levi kept the derringer trained on him while he retrieved Cain's gun. "It's over, Ezra." "No!" Cain struggled to sit up, his face twisted with pain and rage. "It'll never be over. Not until one of us is dead. Then I guess we know how this ends." But as Levi raised the Colt, Tommy's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Don't!" Levi looked down at the boy, who had climbed to his feet despite his grandmother's attempts to keep him down. "Don't become like him," Tommy said quietly. "My grandpa always said that killing a man changes you, makes you less than what you were before." Helen's eyes were bright with tears, but she nodded. "The boy's right, Levi. Frank used to say that every man deserves the chance to face his judgment in his own time." Cain laughed bitterly from the floor. "Listen to them, Wilde. Listen to the innocents preach mercy to the damned." Levi looked at the gun in his hand, then at Cain bleeding on the floor, then at the faces of the woman and boy who'd somehow become his anchor to the world of the living. "Get out," he said finally. Cain's eyes widened. "What? Take your dead and get out. Don't come back. You think this ends here? You think—" Levi cocked the hammer of Cain's own gun and pointed it at his head. "I think you've got about 10 seconds to start moving before I change my mind about mercy." Cain struggled to his feet, swaying from blood loss and shock. He looked around at his dead men, at the wreckage of the store, at the faces of the townspeople now gathered outside. "This isn't over," he said. Yes, Levi replied quietly. It is. Cain stumbled toward the door, leaving bloody handprints on everything he touched. At the threshold, he turned back one last time. They'll never accept you. Wilde. You'll always be the ghost. Then he was gone, staggering toward his horse, leaving Levi alone with the living and the dead and the terrible silence that follows violence. Tommy tugged at Levi's sleeve. Mr. Levi? Yes, son. Are you going back to the mountain now? Levi looked out through the broken window at the high country that had been his home and his prison for 20 years. Then he looked down at the boy with his grandfather's eyes and his grandmother's courage. Not just yet, he said. Cain didn't get far. Levi found him 2 miles out of town, slumped against a cottonwood tree beside the creek, his horse grazing nearby with its reins trailing in the dust. The shoulder wound had reopened during his ride, soaking his shirt crimson and leaving a trail that a blind man could follow. Stubborn as always, Cain said, without looking up as Levi approached. Blood flecked his lips when he spoke, internal bleeding probably from where he'd hit the ground. Come to finish what you started. Levi dismounted and knelt beside his former captain, examining the wound with the clinical detachment he'd learned during 4 years of war. The bullet had shattered Cain's collarbone and nicked an artery. Without proper medical attention, he'd bleed out within the hour. Doc Palmer's back in town, Levi said. He could patch you up. Cain laughed, a wet sound that spoke of punctured lungs. And then what? A trial? A rope? No thank you, Ghost. I'll die on my own terms. From his coat pocket, Cain withdrew a small wooden cross, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. Levi recognized it, the same cross Cain had carved during the siege of Vicksburg, whittling it from a piece of church pew while they waited for the Confederates to starve. You remember this? Cain held it up to the fading light. I remember. I made it for my boy, little Marcus. He would have been your Samuel's age. Cain's voice had gone soft, the madness fading as death crept closer. Border raiders got them too. Mary Catherine, little Marcus, even the dog. Burned the house down around them while I was off playing soldier. Levi felt something cold settle in his chest. The same raid? 3 days earlier. Same gang, different target. Cain coughed, specks of blood hitting his hand. Funny how fate works, isn't it? We were both hunting ghosts, Wilde. I just chose the wrong ones. The wooden cross caught the last rays of sunlight, filtering through the cottonwood leaves. And for a moment, Cain looked like the man Levi had once respected, before the war had carved away everything decent and left only the raw desire for revenge. Why didn't you tell me? Levi asked. Because I needed someone to blame, someone to hate, and you were convenient. Cain closed his eyes, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. 20 years I spent hunting you, when I should have been hunting the bastards who really killed them. Who were they? Does it matter now? Cain's hand went limp, the wooden cross falling to the ground beside him. We're all dead men, Wilde. Some of us just haven't stopped breathing yet. The last light faded from Cain's eyes as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Levi sat beside the body for a long time, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely sound that echoed across the valley like a prayer for the departed. When he finally returned to town, bearing Cain's body draped across his horse, the entire population of Cedar Ridge seemed to be waiting for him. They stood in small groups along Main Street, their faces illuminated by lanterns and torches, speaking in the hushed tones reserved for funerals and other forms of reckoning. Doc Palmer emerged from his office, medical bag in hand, but stopped when he saw the still form across Levi's saddle. Natural causes? The doctor asked quietly. Close enough, Levi replied. Sheriff Morrison's body had been moved to the undertaker's, and someone had swept up the broken glass from Helen's storefront. The bullet holes in the walls would take longer to repair. But Cedar Ridge was the kind of place that knew how to heal from violence. Helen appeared at her store's entrance, Tommy beside her, both of them watching as Levi dismounted and began untying Cain's body from the saddle. I'll help you with that, said a voice behind him. Levi turned to see a tall man with graying hair and the kind of hands that spoke of honest work. He didn't recognize the face, but something about the man's bearing suggested military service. "Name's Wade Hutchins," the man said, extending his hand. "I own the livery stable, Levi Wilde. I know who you are." Wade took hold of Kane's boots, while Levi grasped the shoulders. "Served under General Grant myself. Never made it as far as Shiloh, but I heard the stories." They carried Kane's body toward the undertaker's parlor, the crowd parting silently before them. As they walked, Wade spoke in the matter-of-fact tone of a man who'd seen his share of death. "Morrison was a good sheriff. Bit slow maybe, but honest. The town's going to need someone to pin that badge on. I'm not looking for work. Maybe not. But maybe work's looking for you." They deposited Kane's body at the undertaker's and walked back toward the main street. The crowd had begun to disperse, but Helen and Tommy were still waiting by the store. "You planning to head back up to your mountain?" Helen asked as they approached. Levi looked up at the dark slopes where his cabin waited, silent and empty. Then he looked at the boy beside her, at the town that had shown him more kindness than he'd deserved, at the woman whose steady presence had become the closest thing to an anchor he'd known since Mary died. "Haven't decided yet." Tommy stepped forward, his young face serious in the lantern light. "My grandpa used to say that sometimes a man's got to choose between what's easy and what's necessary. Grandpa was a wise man. He also said that the best men are the ones who've made mistakes and learned from them." Tommy's eyes met Levi's directly. "I think you've learned plenty." Helen placed her hand on her grandson's shoulder. "What Tommy's trying to say is that you're welcome here, Levi, for as long as you want to stay." The words hung in the evening air like a challenge and an invitation combined. Around them, Cedar Ridge settled into its nighttime rhythms, lamps being lit in windows, families gathering for late suppers, the normal sounds of a community that had survived another day. "The store will need repairs," Levi said finally. Helen smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all day. "I suppose it will. I know something about carpentry. I'd be grateful for the help." Wade Hutchins cleared his throat. "Town council meets tomorrow night. We'll need to discuss the sheriff situation." "I told you, just think about it," Wade interrupted gently. "Cedar Ridge could use a man who understands the difference between justice and vengeance." As if summoned by their conversation, Doc Palmer appeared at Levi's elbow, his medical bag traded for a bottle of whiskey and 3 glasses. "I figure we could all use a drink," the doctor said, pouring amber liquid into each glass. "To Sheriff Morrison, who died doing his job." They drank in silence, the whiskey burning away some of the day's bitter taste. "And to second chances," Doc added, refilling the glasses. "To second chances," Helen echoed. Levi raised his glass, but didn't drink immediately. Instead, he looked around at the faces surrounding him, people who'd seen him at his worst and were still willing to offer him their best. 2. Learning the difference between running from the past and making peace with it, he said finally, and drained his glass in one swallow. Later, after the town had settled into sleep and the streets were empty except for shadows and starlight, Levi sat on Helen's front porch with his rifle across his knees. Old habits died hard, and there was always the chance that Kane had left more surprises behind. But as the night wore on and nothing stirred except the normal sounds of a peaceful town, Levi found himself thinking not about danger, but about possibility, about what it might mean to come down from the mountain for good, to rejoin the world of the living instead of haunting its edges like a specter. In his coat pocket, his fingers found the wooden cross he'd taken from Kane's body. Such a small thing to carry so much weight. The hopes of a father, the innocence of a child, the terrible price of misplaced blame. Tomorrow he would bury it beside Kane's grave, along with 20 years of guilt and anger and self-imposed exile. Tonight he would sit watch over a town that had shown him mercy he'd never thought to ask for. The moon rose full and bright above Cedar Ridge, casting silver light on new possibilities and the long road back to redemption. The nightmare always began the same way. April 6, 1862. The morning mist rising off the Tennessee River like the breath of sleeping giants. Young Levi Wilde, 19 years old and still believing in the righteousness of causes, crouched behind a fallen oak with his Enfield rifle pressed against his shoulder. Beside him, Ezra Kane, 23 and already marked for greatness, studied the Confederate positions through a battered spyglass. "You see that church steeple?" Kane whispered, his Kentucky drawl soft as silk. "There's a sniper up there, picking off our officers like ducks on a pond." Levi squinted through the morning haze and smoke, finally catching a glimpse of movement in the bell tower. "I see him. Range? 300 yards, maybe a bit more." Levi calculated wind speed and elevation, the way his daddy had taught him when hunting deer back home in Tennessee. Difficult shot, but not impossible. Kane clapped him on the shoulder, the gesture both friendly and commanding. "That's why you're here, farm boy. Make it possible." The shot had been clean, a single crack that silenced the Confederate rifle forever. Levi watched the enemy sniper tumble from the bell tower like a broken doll and felt something cold and final settle in his chest. His first kill, the first of many. Now, sitting on Helen's porch in the pre-dawn darkness 23 years later, Levi could still feel the weight of that moment. The way Kane had smiled with genuine pride and affection. The way the other soldiers had looked at him with new respect, tinged by fear. The way the world had suddenly become a place where Levi Wilde was very, very good at killing. "You've been out here all night." Helen's voice came from the doorway behind him, soft with concern. She emerged onto the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee, handing one to him before settling into the chair beside his. "Old habits," Levi said, accepting the coffee gratefully. The liquid was hot and strong, chasing away some of the night's chill and the lingering shadows of memory. Bad dreams. Levi looked at her in the growing light of dawn. Helen Crawford, at 45, was still a handsome woman, with silver threads in her brown hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter more than sorrow. She'd buried a husband and raised a grandson while keeping a failing business alive through sheer determination. If anyone understood nightmares, it would be her. "Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried," he said finally. "No," she agreed, sipping her coffee. "Sometimes it doesn't." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Cedar Ridge was waking up around them, smoke rising from chimneys, doors opening, the sounds of a community beginning another day. Normal sounds. "Peaceful sounds. Tommy asked me something last night," Helen said. "He wanted to know if you were really a hero in the war." Levi's laugh was bitter.
"What did you tell him?"
"I told him that heroism is complicated, that sometimes good men have to do terrible things, and sometimes terrible men convince themselves they're doing good. And which am I?" Helen studied his face in the morning light, her gaze direct and uncompromising. "I think you're a man who's been carrying other people's sins along with his own for too long." Before Levi could respond, Tommy burst through the front door, already dressed and full of 8-year-old energy despite the early hour. "Mr. Levi, are you really going to be our new sheriff?" "Where did you hear that?" Wade Hutchins told Doc Palmer, and Doc Palmer told Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house, and she told everybody. Tommy flopped down on the porch steps, looking up at Levi with expectant eyes. "So are you?" "I haven't decided." "Well, you should. Sheriff Morrison was nice, but he couldn't track a wounded bear through fresh snow." "And you're the ghost of Shiloh." Helen gave her grandson a sharp look. "Tommy, what?" "It's true. Billy Henderson's PA served with the 15th Tennessee, and he said everybody knew about the ghost. Said he could put a bullet through a playing card at 500 yards. Billy Henderson's PA also claims he once arm-wrestled a grizzly bear." Helen said dryly, but Levi was remembering another conversation. Another young soldier full of admiration and bloodlust. Private Jamie Morris from Georgia, barely 16 and eager to prove himself in the war between the states. "Is it true what they say, Ghost?" Morris had asked after Chickamauga, his voice hushed with awe. "Did you really kill 30 rebels at Stones River?" "Numbers don't matter, son," Levi had replied, already weary of his growing reputation. Dead is dead, but Morris hadn't listened. None of them had. They'd heard only the legend, not the cost. They'd seen the skill without understanding the price it exacted on the man who wielded it. 3 days later, Morris had volunteered for a scouting mission behind enemy lines, trying to be the hero the stories promised he could become. They'd found his body a week later, mutilated beyond recognition. "Mr. Levi?" Tommy's voice pulled him back to the present. "You look sad. Just remembering old friends. Were they good friends?" Levi thought of Cain's madness, of Morris's eagerness, of all the young men who'd followed him into battle and never came home. Some of them. The best ones died too soon. Helen stood, smoothing her skirts. "Tommy, go help Doc Palmer with his morning rounds. He's getting too old to carry that medical bag by himself," the boy protested, but a look from his grandmother sent him scampering down the street toward the doctor's office. When he was gone, Helen turned back to Levi. "The town council really is meeting tonight. They'll offer you Morrison's badge. I know. Will you take it?" Levi finished his coffee and set the cup aside. 23 years ago, I swore an oath to serve and protect. Then I spent 4 years learning that sometimes serving means destroying, and protecting one thing means failing to protect another. And now? Now I don't know if I remember how to serve without destroying. Helen was quiet for a long moment, watching the town come alive in the morning sun. Finally she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "My Frank used to say that the measure of a man isn't in the mistakes he's made, but in what he does after he realizes he's made them. You've been punishing yourself for 20 years, Levi. Maybe it's time to try something different." "Like what?" "Like forgiveness, starting with yourself." She went back inside, leaving Levi alone with his thoughts and the Confederate battle flag that Cain had carried to his grave. He'd found it among the dead captain's belongings, faded and torn, but still recognizable. The stars and bars that had flown over 100 battlefields where brothers had killed brothers in the name of causes they barely understood. Cain had kept it as a reminder, a symbol of the honor he'd lost and could never regain. But staring at it now, Levi saw something different. Not a monument to lost glory, but a testament to the terrible cost of letting the past poison the present. The flag was cotton and silk, nothing more. It had no power except what men gave it, like guilt, like shame, like the ghosts that had haunted both Cain and Levi for 23 years. That evening, the entire town seemed to crowd into Hutchins' livery stable for the council meeting. Levi sat in the back, uncomfortable with the attention but unwilling to leave. These people deserved to know what kind of man they were considering for sheriff. Wade Hutchins called for order, his voice carrying easily over the crowd. "I reckon you all know why we're here. Morrison's dead, and we need someone to wear his badge. What about sending to the territorial capital for a replacement?" "Us Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house could take months," replied Doc Palmer. "And we need law now, not later." "Seems to me we've got law right here," said a voice from the crowd. It was Jake Morrison, the dead sheriff's younger brother. "Levi Wilde proved yesterday that he knows how to handle trouble." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled townspeople, but not everyone looked convinced. "He's a killer," said Martha Clemens, the minister's wife. "I've heard the stories." "So was Morrison," Jake shot back. "Difference is, Wilde's better at it." "That's exactly the problem," Martha replied sharply. "We need a peacekeeper, not another gunfighter." Wade Hutchins raised his hand for silence. "Maybe we should let the man speak for himself." He looked directly at Levi. "What do you say, Wilde? Will you take the badge?" Levi stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. These people had seen him kill 5 men in their main street. They'd watched him carry Cain's body back to town. They knew what he was capable of, and they were asking him to be their protector anyway. "I won't lie to you," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet stable. "I've done things in my life that I'm not proud of. I've killed men who probably had families, dreams, reasons for living that had nothing to do with the causes they died for." The crowd was silent, hanging on his words. "But I've also learned the difference between necessary killing and murder, between justice and vengeance, between serving the law and serving your own desires." He paused, thinking of Cain's madness, of his own 20 years of self-imposed exile. "I can't promise I'll be perfect," But I can promise I'll try to be better than I was. The vote wasn't even close. 43 in favor, 7 opposed. Wade Hutchins produced Morrison's badge from his pocket. The silver star tarnished, but still serviceable. Raise your right hand, Wade said solemnly. As Levi recited the oath, the same words he'd spoken as a young soldier so many years ago, he felt something shift inside his chest. Not redemption exactly. That would take time, but the possibility of redemption, the first glimpse of a path that led somewhere other than the mountain's cold embrace. When it was over, and the crowd had dispersed, Helen and Tommy were waiting for him outside the stable. "Sheriff Wilde," Tommy said, grinning broadly. "I like the sound of that. Don't get too excited, son. I might be terrible at it." "Nah," the boy said with absolute confidence. "You'll be the best sheriff Cedar Ridge ever had." As they walked back toward Helen's store in the gathering darkness, Levi found himself thinking not about the past for once, but about the future. About what it might mean to build something instead of destroying it, to protect instead of hunting, to belong to a community instead of haunting its edges. Behind them, the Confederate flag lay forgotten in the stable's dust, just a piece of faded cloth with no power over the living. The badge felt heavier than it looked. Levi pinned it to his vest that first morning, the silver star catching the light from Helen's store window as he stood before her cracked mirror. Sheriff Morrison's clothes fit well enough. They'd been about the same size, but the authority felt foreign on his shoulders. "You look official," Helen said from behind the counter, where she was tallying the previous day's damage. 3 broken windows, 2 overturned display cases, and enough spilled merchandise to stock a small general store. The insurance money, if any came, wouldn't cover half of it. "Feel like a fraud," Levi admitted, adjusting the gun belt. Morrison's Colt was well maintained, but unfamiliar. 20 years of using his own weapons had made him particular about balance and trigger pull. Every man feels like a fraud when he tries something new. "The trick is doing it anyway." Tommy burst through the back door, his arms full of firewood that was almost too big for him to carry. "Morning, Sheriff Levi. Any outlaws to catch today?" "Hope not, son." The boy's face fell slightly. In his 8-year-old imagination, being sheriff probably involved daily shootouts and dramatic horseback chases. The reality, paperwork, settling disputes over property lines, and occasionally rounding up drunks, would likely disappoint him. Levi's first official act was walking the town's perimeter, checking for signs of trouble. Cedar Ridge wasn't large, maybe 200 souls on a busy day, but it sprawled along the creek for nearly a mile. The main street held most of the businesses: Helen's general store, Doc Palmer's office, the saloon, the hotel, the blacksmith, and the church. Residential areas spread outward from there. Modest homes surrounded by kitchen gardens and chicken coops. It was a good town. The kind of place where people knew their neighbors' names and helped each other through hard times. The kind of place Levi had imagined raising Samuel, back when the future held promises instead of regrets. He was examining the fresh boards Wade Hutchins had installed over Helen's broken windows when Doc Palmer emerged from his office, medical bag in hand. "Morning, Sheriff." "Sleep well?" "Well enough." Levi had spent the night in the jail's back room, on a cot that had seen better decades. "Where are you headed?" "Henderson Place. Their youngest came down with fever in the night." The doctor paused, studying Levi's face with professional interest. "You look tired." "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Before Levi could answer, a commotion erupted from the direction of the saloon. Raised voices, the sound of breaking glass, and then a man's voice, shouting something about cheating at cards. Both men turned toward the noise, but Levi was already moving, his hand instinctively checking the position of his gun. 20 years in the mountains hadn't dulled his reflexes. "Stay back, Doc," he said. Though Palmer was already retreating toward his office, the saloon's bat-wing doors burst open as Levi approached, and the man stumbled out backward, his hands raised in surrender. Behind him came another man, bigger, drunk, and holding a broken bottle like a weapon. "I saw you palm that ace, you son of a bitch," the big man slurred. "Nobody cheats Bart Reeves and walks away." The smaller man, a traveling merchant by his clothes, back toward the street, his eyes wide with fear. "I never cheated nobody. The cards just fell my way is all." Levi stepped between them, his presence enough to stop both men in their tracks. Up close, Reeves was even bigger than he'd looked from a distance, 6.5 feet of muscle and alcohol-fueled rage. The kind of man who solved problems with his fists and worried about consequences later. "Morning, gentlemen," Levi said calmly. "Seems we have a disagreement." Reeves squinted at the badge on Levi's chest, then laughed. "Well, well, the famous ghost of Shiloh playing at being a lawman. This ought to be interesting." The merchant looked confused but hopeful. "Sheriff, this man accused me of cheating, but I swear on my mother's grave—" "Shut up," Reeves snarled, waving the broken bottle. "I'm talking to the killer here." Levi felt the familiar coldness settle over him, the same feeling that had preceded every battlefield encounter. But this wasn't a battlefield, and Reeves wasn't an enemy soldier. This was just a drunk man with hurt pride and poor judgment. "Put the bottle down, Reeves," Levi said quietly. "Or what? You'll shoot me down like you did Cain and his boys?" Reeves took a step forward, swaying slightly. "Whole town's talking about it. How the great ghost came down from his mountain to play hero." A crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Levi could see Helen in her store doorway, Tommy beside her, both watching with worried expressions. This was his first test as sheriff, and half the town was witnessing it. "Last warning," Levi said. Reeves grinned, showing teeth stained brown with tobacco. "You know what I think? I think you're all reputation and no substance. I think you're just another old man trying to—" The merchant chose that moment to make a break for it, darting toward the hotel. Reeves spun to follow him, and Levi moved. 20 years of mountain living had kept him in good condition, but it had been even longer since he'd fought hand to hand. Reeves was younger, stronger, and fueled by liquid courage. But Levi had something Reeves didn't: the cold, calculating mindset of a man who'd learned to kill efficiently. The fight lasted less than 30 seconds. Levi grabbed Reeves's wrist, twisted until the broken bottle fell from nerveless fingers, then swept the big man's legs out from under him. Reeves hit the dirt hard, all the wind knocked out of his lungs, and found himself staring up at the barrel of Levi's Colt. "You're under arrest for disturbing the peace and threatening a citizen," Levi said. Not even breathing hard, Reeves blinked up at him, the alcohol haze clearing from his eyes as he realized how quickly the fight had ended. "Jesus Christ, Sheriff, I was just funning." "Funny thing about fun," Levi replied, holstering his gun and hauling Reeves to his feet. "Somebody usually gets hurt." The jail was a stone building behind the sheriff's office, with 2 cells that had rarely seen use during Morrison's tenure. Levi locked Reeves in the first one and left him to sleep off his drunk. The merchant, meanwhile, had disappeared entirely, probably on the first stage out of town. Levi couldn't blame him. Cedar Ridge was supposed to be a peaceful place to rest and resupply, not a setting for saloon brawls. "Impressive work, Sheriff." Levi turned to find a stranger watching him from the jail's doorway. The man was well-dressed, maybe 40 years old, with the kind of pale hands that spoke of office work rather than manual labor. "A lawyer, perhaps, or a banker. Can I help you, Mr. Whitman?" "Charles Whitman, Territorial Inspector." The man produced an official-looking badge from his coat. "I'm here to assess Cedar Ridge's law enforcement capabilities." Levi felt his stomach drop. A territorial inspector could mean only one thing. Someone in the capital had heard about yesterday's shooting and wanted to investigate. "Bad timing for a visit," Levi said carefully. Whitman smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "On the contrary, Sheriff Wilde, I'd say my timing was perfect." They stood there for a moment, measuring each other. Whitman had the soft look of a man who'd never been in a real fight, but his eyes held the hard calculation of someone who fought with paperwork and legal precedent instead of fists and guns. "I'll need to examine your records," Whitman said finally. "Incident reports, arrest records, any documentation of yesterday's events." Morrison kept everything in his desk. "You're welcome to look." But as they walked toward the sheriff's office, Levi couldn't shake the feeling that Charles Whitman hadn't come to Cedar Ridge by coincidence. Something about the man's timing, his too casual manner, suggested a deeper purpose. The office was small and cluttered, dominated by Morrison's old desk and a gun rack that held more dust than weapons. Whitman immediately went to work, pulling out files and examining them with the methodical thoroughness of a man accustomed to finding problems in other people's paperwork. "Interesting," he murmured after several minutes. Sheriff Morrison filed very few incident reports in his final year. Either Cedar Ridge is the most peaceful town in the territory, or Morrison wasn't much for paperwork, Levi finished. "Quite, and now we have a new sheriff with a rather colorful past." Whitman looked up from the files, his pale eyes studying Levi's face. "Tell me, Sheriff Wilde, do you believe yesterday's violence was justified?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Levi thought of Kane's madness, of Helen and Tommy threatened, of Sheriff Morrison lying dead in the street. He thought of the 5 men he'd killed to protect people who'd shown him nothing but kindness. "A man came to my town with violence in his heart," Levi said quietly. "I stopped him." "Your town?" The correction was gentle but pointed. Levi had been sheriff for less than 24 hours, but already he'd claimed Cedar Ridge as his own. Whitman had noticed and filed it away. "The town I'm sworn to protect," Levi corrected. "Indeed. And how do you intend to protect it, Sheriff? With more violence?" Before Levi could answer, Tommy came bursting through the office door, his face flushed with excitement and alarm. "Sheriff Levi, there's riders coming up the valley road. A whole bunch of them." Levi was at the window in 3 strides, peering through the dust-streaked glass at the approaching column. 6 men on horseback, riding hard and fast towards Cedar Ridge. Even at a distance, he could see the glint of weapons and the purposeful way they moved. More trouble. As if Kane's attack had been just the beginning. "How many, son?" he asked Tommy. 6 that I could count. Maybe more behind them." Whitman appeared at Levi's shoulder, his bureaucratic calm finally cracking. "Outlaws?" "Don't know yet," Levi replied, checking his guns. "But they're not riding like men with peaceful intentions." The riders were close enough now to make out details. Hard-faced men, with the look of professionals about them. Bounty hunters maybe, or hired guns. The kind of men who made their living with violence and asked questions later. "Tommy, go to your grandmother. Tell her to lock the store and keep you both inside until this is over." The boy nodded and ran off, leaving Levi alone with Whitman and the approaching storm. "Perhaps I should wire for territorial marshals," Whitman suggested, his face pale. "No time," Levi replied, stepping out into the street. The riders had reached the town's outskirts now, their horses lathered with sweat from hard travel. As they approached, Levi could see the leader, a man with cold eyes and a cavalry saber hanging from his saddle. The same kind of saber Kane had carried during the war, the same kind of saber that had once belonged to Confederate officers who'd learned to kill with style as well as efficiency. The riders stopped 50 yards away, their leader studying Levi with the interest of a man appraising potential prey. "You Levi Wilde?" The man called out. "I am. My name's Colonel Bradford Morrison. I believe you killed my son yesterday." The words hit Levi like a physical blow. Morrison, the same name as Cedar Ridge's dead sheriff, which meant these weren't random outlaws or bounty hunters. They were family, coming for justice or vengeance, or whatever passed for satisfaction, in a world where violence begat violence in endless cycles. "Your son drew on me first," Levi called back. "My son was a good man trying to serve his country, and you cut him down like a dog in the street." Morrison's hand drifted toward his saber, and his men shifted in their saddles, ready for whatever their leader decided to do. "Colonel," Levi said carefully, "I'm sorry for your loss, but your son knew the risks when he put on that uniform." "Uniform?" Morrison laughed bitterly. "What uniform? Jake wasn't a soldier, Wilde. He was a shopkeeper from Kansas, trying to make an honest living." The world seemed to tilt under Levi's feet. Jake Morrison, the dead sheriff's brother, who'd spoken in favor of Levi's appointment just the night before. But that Jake Morrison was very much alive, had voted for Levi himself, which meant there had been another Morrison among Kane's men. Another son, Another family destroyed by the violence that followed Levi wherever he went. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Levi began, but Colonel Morrison was done talking. His hand closed around his saber's hilt, and his men's rifles swung toward Levi with practiced precision. "The only misunderstanding," Morrison said coldly, "was thinking you deserved to live after what you've done." The cavalry saber cleared its sheath with a sound like death itself, bright steel catching the afternoon sun. And Levi Wilde, sheriff of Cedar Ridge for exactly one day, found himself facing 6 armed men who'd come to collect a debt he wasn't sure he owed. Behind him, Charles Whitman was probably taking notes for his official report. Ahead of him, 6 guns were aimed at his heart, and in between, the weight of 23 years of violence pressed down like a mountain made of guilt and consequences. Levi could see every detail with crystal clarity. The way Morrison's saber caught the light, the nervous twitch in one rider's jaw, the small medicine bag hanging from another man's saddle horn, a Native American pouch beaded with the geometric patterns of the Cheyenne Nation. That bag told a story. Someone among Morrison's men had dealings with the tribes, had earned enough respect to be gifted with sacred medicine. It was a detail that might matter later, if there was a later. "Colonel Morrison," Levi said, his voice steady despite the 6 rifles pointed at his chest. "Before we do something we can't take back, let me ask you something. You're in no position to ask anything, Wilde. Humor a dying man. What did your son look like?" Morrison's eyes narrowed. "What kind of question is that?" "A simple one. Tall, short."
"Hair color?"
He was tall. Brown hair, like his mother's, had a scar on his chin from when he fell off his horse as a boy. Morrison's voice cracked slightly. "Why does it matter?" Levi felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Because the man I killed yesterday was short, blond, and had all his teeth. No scars anywhere I could see. The silence that followed was heavy as mountain stone." Morrison's saber wavered, doubt creeping into his cold eyes. "You're lying. Ask anyone in town. Ask the undertaker." Levi gestured toward Cedar Ridge's main street, where curious faces had begun appearing in windows and doorways. "Ask the territorial inspector standing right behind me." Whitman cleared his throat nervously. I did examine the bodies yesterday evening, Colonel Morrison. The sheriff's description is accurate." Morrison's hand tightened on his saber, but the weapon dropped another inch. "Then where is my son?" Kane's telegram said he was riding with them. Before Levi could answer, a new voice cut through the tension. "Pa!" Everyone turned toward the sound. A young man had emerged from the general store, tall and brown-haired, with a familiar scar on his chin. He walked slowly toward the confrontation, his hands raised and empty. "Danny Morrison," Levi breathed, recognizing the face at last. Not one of Kane's men, but one of Cedar Ridge's own citizens. Jake Morrison's nephew, visiting from Kansas. Colonel Morrison's saber fell from nerveless fingers, clattering on the hard-packed dirt. "Daniel, but Kane's telegram. He said you were dead. Kane lied to you, Pa." Danny stepped closer, his young face heavy with understanding. "He used me to get to Sheriff Wilde here. Told me he was an old war buddy, asked me to carry messages and such. I didn't know what he was really planning." The pieces fell together in Levi's mind like a puzzle solving itself. Kane hadn't just come for revenge. He'd come to destroy everything Levi might care about. Using an innocent boy as bait had been cruel, even by Kane's standards. Morrison dismounted slowly, his face cycling through relief, anger, and confusion. "But the telegram said I was killed in a shootout with the infamous ghost of Shiloh." Danny's voice carried the bitterness of a young man who'd learned that the world was more complicated than he'd imagined. "Kane figured that would bring you running, ready for blood." "It did," Morrison admitted, his cavalry bearing crumbling as he embraced his son. "Lord help me, it did." Levi watched the reunion with mixed emotions. Relief that he wouldn't have to kill 6 more men. Sadness for the manipulation that had brought them here. And a growing anger at Kane's posthumous cruelty. The medicine bag caught his attention again, hanging from the saddle of Morrison's sergeant, a grizzled man with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years on the frontier. As Morrison and his son talked, the sergeant dismounted and approached Levi. "Name's William Crow Dog," the man said quietly. "Served with the colonel during the Indian Wars. That bag there was given to me by a Cheyenne medicine man after I helped his people through a bad winter." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because that medicine man, Joseph Little Wolf, he knew your name. Said you spent time with his band up in the high country, learned their ways of surviving in the mountains." Levi remembered. The winter of 1866, when grief had driven him higher into the peaks than any white man had reason to go. He'd been half dead from cold and starvation when Little Wolf's people found him. They could have left him to die, would have been justified in doing so, given what his people had done to theirs. Instead, they'd nursed him back to health and taught him the skills that had kept him alive for 20 years. "Little Wolf is dead now," Crow Dog continued. "But before he passed, he told me something. Said the mountain ghost would come down one day when the spirits judged him ready to rejoin the world of the living. I don't put much stock in spirit talk. Maybe not. But Little Wolf said something else, something that might interest you more." Crow Dog's eyes were serious. "He said Cain wasn't the only ghost hunting you." Before Levi could ask what that meant, Morrison and his son had finished their reunion. The colonel approached, his earlier hostility replaced by something approaching shame. "Sheriff Wilde, I owe you an apology. And an explanation." Levi waited. "Cain sent word that my boy was dead, killed by the ghost of Shiloh in some god-forsaken mountain town. Said he was riding to avenge Daniel's death, asked if I wanted justice." Morrison's jaw worked. "I should have known better. Should have asked more questions." Cain was persuasive when he wanted to be. That he was. Persuasive and poison mean when crossed. Morrison studied Levi's face. "You really kill him?" "He died, yes. Whether I killed him or his own madness did." Levi shrugged. "Does it matter?" Morrison considered this. "I suppose not. Man makes his choices, lives with the consequences." He paused. "What Cain did to my boy, using him as bait, that was unforgivable. Cain stopped caring about forgiveness a long time ago." The colonel nodded and turned to his men, who had dismounted and were tending their horses. "We'll camp outside town tonight, move on in the morning." "I apologize for the disruption." But as Morrison's men began making camp, Crow Dog pulled Levi aside. "There's something you need to know," the sergeant said quietly. "About what Little Wolf told me." They walked away from the others, finding privacy near the creek that ran behind Helen's store. The water chuckled over smooth stones, a peaceful sound that seemed at odds with the day's tensions. "Little Wolf had visions sometimes," Crow Dog said. "Saw things before they happened. Called it the gift of the thunder spirits. And 3 months before he died, he came to me with a warning. Said the mountain ghost would face 3 trials before he found peace. The first would be facing his past. That was Cain. The second would be protecting his new family. That was today, with the colonel and his men." Levi felt a chill despite the afternoon warmth. "And the third?" "The third would be the hardest. He'd have to choose between justice and mercy, between the man he was and the man he could become." Crow Dog's weathered face was grave. "Little Wolf said if he chose wrong, the ghost would be trapped forever, neither living nor dead." "When?" "Soon, before the moon turns full again." Levi looked up at the sky, where the moon hung pale and thin in the afternoon light. 2 weeks, maybe less. Did he say anything else?" "Only that the choice would come from someone you trusted, someone who knew your true name." Crow Dog left him there by the creek, rejoining Morrison's men as they set up their temporary camp. Levi stood alone in the growing shadows, listening to the water and trying to make sense of an old medicine man's prophecy. But prophecy or not, one thing was certain: trouble had a way of finding Levi Wilde, no matter where he tried to hide. And if Little Wolf was right, the worst was yet to come. That evening, after Morrison's men had departed and the town had settled into its normal rhythms, Levi found himself sitting on Helen's porch again. The medicine bag from Crow Dog's saddle had given him much to think about, memories of his time with Little Wolf's people flooding back. They'd been kind to him, those Cheyenne. kinder than he'd deserved, given the uniform he'd worn and the things he'd done in service to a country that saw them as obstacles to progress. Little Wolf in particular had treated him not as an enemy, but as a lost soul in need of guidance. The mountain holds many spirits, the old medicine man had told him one night as they sat around a fire of juniper and sage. Some are at peace, some are angry, and some are just lost. You are lost, mountain ghost. But lost does not mean beyond finding. Now, 23 years later, Levi was beginning to understand what the old man had meant. The mountains had been his prison as much as his refuge, a place to hide from the world and from himself. Coming down to Cedar Ridge, accepting the badge, trying to build something instead of just surviving, maybe that was what Little Wolf had seen in his visions. The first trial, facing his past, was over. Cain was dead and buried, taking 20 years of guilt and hatred with him to the grave. The second trial, protecting his new family, had passed as well. Morrison and his men were gone, the misunderstanding cleared up without additional bloodshed. But the third trial loomed ahead, undefined but inevitable. A choice between justice and mercy, between the man he was and the man he could become. Helen emerged from the store carrying 2 cups of coffee, settling into the chair beside his with the easy familiarity of a woman who'd made peace with life's complications. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, offering him one of the cups. Levi accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. "Just thinking about old friends and older debts. The Indian sergeant seemed to know you. We have mutual acquaintances." Helen studied his profile in the lamplight spilling from her store window. "There's more to your story than you've told, isn't there?" "There always is. Will you tell me someday?" Levi looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the surface to the strength underneath. Helen Crawford had buried a husband, raised a grandson, and kept a failing business alive through determination and grace. She'd shown kindness to a man the rest of the world saw as a dangerous ghost. "If anyone deserved the truth, it was her. Someday," he said. "When I figure out how it ends." Later that night, alone in the jail's back room, Levi examined the medicine bag Crow Dog had left for him. Inside were the traditional items: sage, sweetgrass, small bones carved with symbols he didn't recognize. But at the bottom, wrapped in soft deerskin, was something unexpected, a photograph. Not a daguerreotype like the one on his mantle, but a newer image printed on paper. It showed a group of people standing outside a church, white settlers and Cheyenne together, unified in some common purpose. On the back, written in Little Wolf's careful English, were the words, "The ghost learns to live again. The spirits are watching." Levi stared at the photograph for a long time, seeing in those faces a possibility he'd never considered. White and Indian, past and present, enemies become allies through understanding and mutual respect. Maybe that was the answer Little Wolf had been trying to give him. Maybe the third trial wasn't about choosing between justice and mercy, but about learning that sometimes they were the same thing, outside. Cedar Ridge slept peacefully under the stars, protected by a man who was slowly learning the difference between being a ghost and being haunted. The moon hung thin and pale above the mountains, marking time until the final test arrived. The photograph arrived on the Wednesday stage, wrapped in brown paper and addressed to Sheriff Levi Wilde, in handwriting he didn't recognize. The stage driver, an old-timer named Hutchins, who was Wade's brother, handed it over with the casual indifference of a man who'd seen every kind of human drama play out in frontier towns. "Came from Denver," Hutchins said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Clark said it was important." Levi examined the package in his office, noting the quality paper and careful wrapping. Someone had taken pains to ensure this reached him intact. Inside was a photograph, partially burned, as if someone had tried to destroy it, but changed their mind at the last moment. The image showed a family portrait. A woman and 2 children standing beside a wooden fence, mountains visible in the background. The woman was pretty in the way frontier wives often were, with strong hands and eyes that had seen hardship. The children, A boy about 10 and a girl maybe 7 had their mother's smile and their father's stubborn jaw. But it was the note on the back that made Levi's blood turn cold. Sarah Kane and her children, Marcus and Mary Elizabeth, killed in Pueblo raid, September 15th, 1864. Same gang that hit your place 3 days later. Kane blamed you for not protecting them. Truth is, he wasn't there either. He was too busy chasing glory to save his own family. A friend who knows. The photograph slipped from Levi's fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dying bird. He stared at it, his mind racing through implications that rearranged 23 years of assumed guilt. Kane's family hadn't died in the same raid that killed Mary and Samuel. They died 3 days earlier, which meant Kane had known about the raiders, had known they were moving through the territory, and had done nothing to warn anyone. More than that, if Kane had been chasing glory instead of protecting his family, then he'd been guilty of the same failing he'd spent 2 decades blaming Levi for. The burned edges of the photograph told their own story. Someone had tried to destroy this evidence, then thought better of it. Someone who knew the truth about what had happened, who'd carried this secret for over 20 years. A knock on the office door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Charles Whitman entered, his territorial inspector's badge catching the afternoon light. He'd been in town for 3 days now, examining records and interviewing townspeople with the methodical thoroughness of a man building a case. "Sheriff Wilde, I was hoping we could talk." Levi slipped the photograph into his desk drawer, but not before Whitman's sharp eyes caught the movement. "About what?" "About your future in law enforcement." Whitman settled into the chair across from Levi's desk, his pale hands folded precisely. "I've completed my initial assessment of the situation here, and I'm concerned about your methods. 5 men dead in your first confrontation. Another incident with Colonel Morrison's men that could have turned ugly." Whitman's voice was reasonable, professional. "The territorial government values peace and stability above all else." Levi leaned back in his chair, studying the bureaucrat's face. "Those 5 men were threatening innocent people. Morrison was acting on false information. Both situations were resolved with minimal violence." "Minimal?" Whitman raised an eyebrow. "Sheriff, you killed 5 armed men in the space of perhaps 30 seconds. That's not minimal violence, that's exceptional violence. Sometimes exceptional situations call for exceptional responses. Perhaps. But the territorial government has concerns about appointing sheriffs based on their ability to kill, rather than their ability to keep the peace." Levi felt the familiar coldness settle over him, the same feeling that had preceded every deadly encounter since Shiloh. "Are you relieving me of duty, Inspector?" "That depends entirely on you, Sheriff." Whitman leaned forward slightly. "I'm prepared to recommend that you keep your badge, with certain conditions." "What kind of conditions?" Whitman reached into his coat and produced a manila folder, setting it on Levi's desk with deliberate care. "The territorial government is expanding its law enforcement capabilities. We need experienced men for special assignments, situations that require a particular set of skills." Levi didn't touch the folder. "What kind of situations?" "The kind that end with problems disappearing permanently." Whitman's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "The kind that don't appear in official reports." The office fell silent, except for the tick of Morrison's old clock on the mantel. Outside, Cedar Ridge went about its peaceful afternoon business. Children playing in the street, women hanging laundry, men conducting the slow commerce of a frontier town. "You want me to be an assassin?" Levi said finally. "I want you to be a problem solver. There are people in this territory who can't be handled through normal legal channels. People who threaten the stability and progress of civilization." Levi thought of Kane's madness, of the 20 years he'd spent running from his own capacity for violence. "And if I refuse?" "Then I'll have to file a report recommending your removal from office. Excessive force, questionable judgment, potential danger to civilian populations." Whitman shrugged. "You'd be finished as a lawman anywhere in the territory." The folder sat between them like a snake coiled to strike. Levi could see papers inside it, names, photographs, detailed dossiers of men marked for death by bureaucrats who'd never pulled a trigger in anger. How long do I have to decide? Until Monday. The morning stage will carry my report back to Denver one way or another. After Whitman left, Levi sat alone in his office, staring at the folder without opening it. Outside, he could hear Tommy's laughter as the boy played with some of the other children. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds, the kind of sounds he'd dreamed of during 4 years of war and 20 years of exile. He pulled the burned photograph from his drawer, studying the faces of Kane's dead family. Sarah Kane had been beautiful in the way mountain women often were, strong, resilient, built to endure hardship. The children looked happy, secure in the knowledge that their father would protect them from whatever dangers the frontier might hold. Kane had failed them, just as surely as Levi had failed Mary and Samuel. But Kane had spent 23 years projecting that failure onto someone else, twisting truth and memory until he'd convinced himself that Levi was responsible for both tragedies. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Come in." Helen entered, carrying a coffee pot and 2 cups, her face showing the kind of concern that came from genuine caring. "You look troubled." Just thinking about the past. She poured coffee for both of them, then settled into Whitman's recently vacated chair. "Want to talk about it?" Levi almost said no, almost fell back into the habit of carrying his burdens alone. But something about Helen's steady presence, her willingness to offer comfort without asking for explanations, made him reconsider. "What would you do?" he asked carefully. "If someone offered you everything you thought you wanted, but the price was becoming something you'd spent years trying not to be?" Helen considered this, sipping her coffee while she thought. "I suppose it would depend on what I valued more, what I wanted, or who I was. And if those 2 things were mutually exclusive, then I'd have to decide which version of myself I could live with." Before Levi could respond, Tommy burst through the office door with the boundless energy of youth. "Sheriff Levi, there's smoke coming from up in the mountains. Big clouds of it." Levi was at the window in 3 strides, peering up at the high country where he'd made his home for 20 years. Sure enough, thick black smoke was rising from the direction of his old cabin, too much smoke for a simple chimney fire. "Helen, keep Tommy in town. Lock the store and don't let anyone leave until I get back." "Where are you going?" "To see what's burning." The ride up to his cabin took 40 minutes, 40 minutes of watching smoke billow from what had been his sanctuary for 2 decades. By the time he reached the clearing, the fire had consumed most of the structure, leaving only smoldering timbers and the stone chimney standing like a monument to solitude. But this hadn't been an accident. The fire had been set deliberately, professionally. Someone had wanted to destroy not just the cabin, but everything it represented. As Levi picked through the ruins, looking for anything that might have survived, he heard hoofbeats approaching through the trees. His hand went instinctively to his gun, but the rider who emerged from the forest was someone he recognized, Charles Whitman, no longer looking like a soft bureaucrat, but showing the hard edges of a man accustomed to violence. "Unfortunate about your cabin," Whitman said, dismounting with fluid grace. 20 years of memories gone up in smoke. You did this. I did what was necessary to help you see clearly." Whitman's voice had lost its bureaucratic polish, revealing something harder underneath. "A man with nothing to lose is dangerous. A man with something to protect is controllable." Levi felt the familiar coldness, but this time it was different. Not the calculating calm of a killer, but the righteous anger of a man who'd been pushed too far. "You made a mistake," he said quietly. "Did I?" Whitman smiled but kept his distance. "You're alone up here, Wilde. No witnesses, no consequences. I could kill you right now and tell everyone you resisted. Arrest, you could try, but I won't, because you're more valuable to me alive and cooperative." Whitman gestured toward the burning ruins. "Your old life is gone. The question now is what your new life will look like." In the smoldering ashes, something caught Levi's eye. A piece of metal that had survived the flames. His old Bible's metal clasp, warped by heat, but still recognizable. Inside that Bible had been the pressed wildflower, The one he'd picked the day after Mary and Samuel were buried. 20 years of grief, 20 years of guilt, 20 years of self-imposed punishment, all reduced to ash and twisted metal. But as he knelt to retrieve the clasp, he noticed something else in the debris. A small leather pouch, blackened but intact. The medicine bag Joseph Littlewolf had given him all those years ago. The one that was supposed to protect him from evil spirits. It had survived when everything else burned. Interesting, Whitman said, watching Levi pocket the pouch. Still believe in Indian magic? I believe in a lot of things you wouldn't understand, such as... Levi stood, his decision crystallizing like ice on a winter morning. Justice, mercy, the difference between them. Whitman's smile faded. And what does your Indian magic tell you about my offer? It tells me that some spirits can't be bargained with. Levi's hand rested on his gun butt, and some ghosts need to stay buried. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the smoldering ruins of Levi's old life. Whitman's pale eyes showed no fear, only calculation. You have until Monday to decide, Whitman said finally, remounting his horse. Choose wisely, Sheriff. Your town's future depends on it. After he was gone, Levi stood alone among the ashes, holding the medicine bag and trying to understand what had just happened. Whitman wasn't just a territorial inspector. He was something else entirely, something darker and more dangerous. But burning the cabin had been a mistake. It hadn't made Levi more vulnerable. It had freed him from the last chains binding him to his past. The old Levi Wilde, the ghost of Shiloh, the man who'd hidden in the mountains for 20 years, that man was gone, consumed in the flames, along with his self-imposed prison. What remained was something new, something harder to predict or control. As he rode back towards Cedar Ridge, Levi found himself thinking about Littlewolf's prophecy. The third trial, choosing between justice and mercy, between the man he was and the man he could become. Maybe the choice wasn't between those things at all. Maybe it was about becoming someone who could embody both. Someone who understood that true justice sometimes looked like mercy, and real mercy required the strength to enforce justice. The moon was growing fuller, marking time until the final reckoning arrived. But for the first time in 23 years, Levi Wilde wasn't running from it. He was riding toward it. Ready to face whatever came next, Levi sat in the back again, watching faces he'd come to know over the past week. These people had accepted him despite his reputation, had trusted him with their safety, had offered him something he'd thought lost forever, a place to belong. Now Whitman was threatening to take it all away. First order of business, Wade said heavily. The territorial inspector's report. A murmur ran through the crowd. Everyone knew what that meant, even if they didn't know the specific details. Government men didn't come to places like Cedar Ridge to give good news. Maybe we should hear from Sheriff Wilde first, suggested Doc Palmer. Let him explain the situation in his own words. All eyes turned to Levi. He stood slowly, feeling the weight of their expectations, their hopes, their fears for the future. Charles Whitman isn't who he claims to be, Levi said simply. He's not here to assess our law enforcement. He's here to recruit me for something that would make me the kind of man this town deserves protection from. The silence that followed was heavy as mountain snow. What kind of recruitment? Asked Jake Morrison. Levi looked at the dead sheriff's brother, seeing the same steady character that had made Morrison a good lawman. The kind that ends with people disappearing in the night. The kind that serves power instead of justice. And if you refuse, he'll have me removed from office. Make sure I never wear a badge anywhere in the territory. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house spoke up, her voice sharp with indignation. Can he do that? Government men can do pretty much whatever they want, replied Wade grimly. Question is, what do we do about it? The discussion that followed was heated, but respectful. Some argued for writing to the territorial governor. Others suggested contacting federal authorities. A few brave souls even proposed telling Whitman to take his threats and leave town. But Levi barely heard the debate. His attention was focused on the fire steel kit in his pocket, the simple tool that had become a symbol of transformation. Fire could destroy, but it could also clear ground for new growth. Sometimes you had to burn down the old to make room for the better. There's something else, he said, cutting through the discussion. Something you all need to know about what happened here last week. The room fell quiet again. Levi pulled out the burned photograph Whitman had sent him, holding it up for everyone to see. This is Cain's family, his wife and children. They were killed by the same raiders who murdered my Mary and Samuel, but 3 days earlier, gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cain knew about the raiders, could have warned people, could have sent word to the military. Instead, he was off chasing promotions while his own family died. Levi's voice was steady, but carried the weight of 23 years of misplaced guilt. He blamed me for failing to protect them, when the truth is, we both failed in exactly the same way. Helen stood up from her seat near the front. Why are you telling us this now? Because Whitman sent me this photograph. Because he knows things about that time that he shouldn't know. Because I'm starting to think Cain wasn't the only one hunting me all these years. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. If Whitman had access to information from 23 years ago, if he'd been tracking Levi's movements, if he'd somehow orchestrated Cain's attack on Cedar Ridge, you think he's been manipulating events, Doc Palmer said. It wasn't a question. I think he's been waiting for the right moment to make his move. Cain's attack gave him the perfect opportunity, a sheriff with blood on his hands. Isolated from normal legal channels, vulnerable to pressure, Tommy, who'd been listening from beside his grandmother, raised his small hand. Sheriff Levi, what are you going to do? The question cut through all the political maneuvering and adult complications, reducing the situation to its essential core. A boy asking a man he trusted how he planned to protect the people he cared about. I'm going to end this, Levi said quietly. One way or another. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant mountains look close enough to touch. Levi spent the early hours preparing, checking weapons, studying the town's layout, making plans for what he hoped wouldn't be necessary. Whitman had made his position clear. Cooperate or be destroyed. But he'd made 2 critical mistakes. First, he'd underestimated how much Cedar Ridge had come to mean to Levi. Second, he'd revealed himself too early, shown his hand before the game was over. Levi was examining his rifle when Helen knocked on the jail's door. She entered carrying a canvas bag that looked suspiciously like provisions for a journey. Going somewhere, she asked. Maybe. Depends on how Monday goes, and if it goes badly. Levi looked at her, memorizing the way morning light caught in her hair, the determined set of her jaw, the kindness in her eyes that had anchored him to the world of the living. Then I might have to leave Cedar Ridge to protect it. Helen set the bag on his desk and pulled out items one by one. Jerky, hardtack, coffee, ammunition, medical supplies. Everything a man would need to disappear into the mountains and survive for weeks. Frank used to pack bags like this when he was thinking about doing something. Dangerous and stupid, she said conversationally. And did he? Usually. Men seem to think running toward trouble is the same thing as solving problems. She finished unpacking and met his eyes directly. Sometimes they're even right. Before Levi could respond, Tommy appeared in the doorway, his young face serious with purpose. I want to help, the boy announced. Help with what? With whatever you're planning. I know you're planning something, and I want to help. Helen started to object, but Levi held up a hand. What makes you think I'm planning anything, son? Because you've got that look. The same look my grandpa used to get when he was fixing to do something dangerous for the right reasons. Tommy stepped closer, his chin raised defiantly. And because Sheriff Morrison told me once that a man's got to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Your uncle was a wise man. So are you. That's why people trust you. That's why that Whitman fellow is scared of you, out of the mouths of babes. Tommy had seen something the adults had missed, that Whitman's threats came from fear, not strength. The territorial inspector was afraid of what Levi represented, afraid of a man who couldn't be bought or intimidated or controlled. You're right, son. But this isn't something a boy can help with. Maybe not. But I can keep watch. I can carry messages. I can help Grandma keep the store safe. Tommy's voice was steady, mature beyond his 8 years. "My pa always said that everybody's got a part to play when trouble comes calling." Sunday passed quietly, but with the underlying tension of a town holding its breath. Church services that morning drew nearly everyone in Cedar Ridge, as if people wanted to gather together before whatever was coming arrived. Reverend Phillips, a scholarly man with gentle eyes, spoke about facing trials with courage and faith. Levi didn't attend the service, but he could hear the singing from the jail office, voices raised in hymns that spoke of hope and redemption and the possibility of salvation even for the lost. That afternoon, he walked the town's perimeter one more time, noting sightlines and defensive positions. If Whitman brought reinforcements, if the situation turned violent, Levi wanted to be prepared. The fire steel kit in his pocket seemed heavier with each step, weighed down by the decisions it represented. Fire could clear the ground for new growth, but first it had to consume everything that came before. As sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Levi found himself standing in front of the small cemetery where Sheriff Morrison was buried. The grave was still fresh, marked by a simple wooden cross that would be replaced by stone when the widow could afford it. "Don't know if you can hear me, Morrison," Levi said quietly. "But if you can, I want you to know I'll do right by your town, whatever that takes." The wind stirred the grass around the grave, carrying the scent of sage and distant snow. Somewhere in the mountains, a coyote called to its pack, a lonely sound that spoke of wild places and untamed spirits. But Levi wasn't alone anymore. Behind him, the lights of Cedar Ridge were coming on one by one, windows glowing with warmth and life, and the quiet contentment of people who'd found a place worth defending. Tomorrow would bring Whitman's deadline, would force the choice between cooperation and resistance. But tonight, Cedar Ridge was at peace, protected by a man who'd finally learned the difference between being a ghost and being haunted. In his pocket, Joseph Little Wolf's medicine bag seemed to pulse with quiet energy, as if the old medicine man's spirits were watching and waiting to see what choice their mountain ghost would make. The moon was almost full now, casting silver light on new possibilities and old promises kept. Whatever came next, Levi Wilde would face it not as the isolated spectre he'd been for 20 years, but as a man with something worth fighting for, a man with a home to protect. Monday morning came with the weight of Judgment Day. Levi was awake before dawn, sitting in the jail's back room with his coffee and his guns, watching the eastern sky lighten from black to grey to pale gold. The town was still sleeping, but he could feel the tension in the air like the electric charge before a thunderstorm. At precisely 8 o'clock, Charles Whitman emerged from the hotel, dressed in his bureaucratic uniform and carrying a leather satchel. He walked with the confident stride of a man who believed himself in complete control of the situation. Levi met him in the street, his badge catching the morning sun. Around them, Cedar Ridge was stirring to life. Shopkeepers opening their doors, children heading to school, the normal rhythms of a peaceful community. "Sheriff Wilde," Whitman said pleasantly, "I trust you've given my offer proper consideration." "I have." "And?" Levi looked around at the town that had become his home, at the faces appearing in windows and doorways. Helen stood in her store entrance, Tommy beside her, both watching with expressions of quiet faith. Doc Palmer had emerged from his office, his medical bag in hand as always. Wade Hutchins leaned against his livery stable, arms crossed, ready to back whatever play Levi made. "My answer is no," Levi said quietly. Whitman's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered behind his pale eyes. "I see. That's disappointing." He opened his satchel and withdrew a manila folder, holding it up for everyone to see. "In that case, I'm afraid I have no choice but to file this report with the territorial government. It documents your excessive use of force, your questionable judgment, your unsuitability for public office. File away." "You don't understand, Sheriff. This report will end your career. You'll never wear a badge again, anywhere in the territory. More than that, it will raise questions about this town's fitness for territorial protection. Federal marshals might decide Cedar Ridge doesn't deserve their attention when real trouble comes calling. The threat was clear and calculated. Destroy Levi's career and leave the town vulnerable to whatever dangers the frontier might bring. But Whitman had made another mistake. He'd threatened not just Levi, but the people Levi cared about. "There's something you should know about that report," Levi said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I've seen it." Whitman's composure cracked slightly. "Impossible." Levi reached into his coat and pulled out a telegram, unfolding it with deliberate care. "Came in on Saturday's wire. From a friend in Denver who works in the Territorial Records Office." He held up the telegram for everyone to see. "Charles Whitman was dismissed from territorial service 6 months ago for corruption and abuse of authority. He has no official standing, no authority to remove anyone from office, no power to file reports with anyone who matters." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Whitman's hand moving toward the gun under his coat. "You're a confidence man," Levi continued, his own hand resting casually on his gun butt. "A fraud. You've been running some kind of long game, manipulating events, using people like Cain to flush me out." Whitman's mask slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "You always were too clever for your own good, Wilde. Who are you working for?" "People who understand that men like you are dangerous when they're free to make their own choices. People who prefer their killers properly controlled." The pieces clicked together in Levi's mind. 23 years of manipulation and orchestration, of ghosts being hunted by other ghosts, of past sins being weaponized by men who served power instead of justice. "You're the one who's been feeding information to Cain. You arranged the border raids, didn't you? Used them to create the very guilt you've been exploiting ever since." Whitman's smile was cold as winter starlight. "The raids were always going to happen. I simply guided them toward more useful targets." Around them, Cedar Ridge had gone completely still. Even the children had stopped playing, sensing the adult drama unfolding in their midst. Sarah Kane, Mary and Samuel Wilde, all those families, you killed them to create weapons you could use later. I created opportunities. What people did with those opportunities was their choice. Levi felt the familiar coldness. But this time it was different. Not the detached calm of a killer, but the righteous fury of a man who discovered the architect of his own destruction. "Your mistake," he said quietly, "was coming here. Was threatening these people, was it?" Whitman's hand closed around his gun grip. "Because I count 6 men with rifles trained on you right now." Levi looked around and saw them, professional shooters positioned on rooftops and in doorways, all with their weapons aimed at his chest. He'd been so focused on Whitman that he'd missed the trap being sprung around him. 6 against 1, Whitman continued conversationally. "Even the ghost of Shiloh can't beat those odds." But as the words left his mouth, something unexpected happened. Wade Hutchins stepped out of his livery stable with a shotgun in his hands, aimed squarely at the nearest sniper. "Maybe not," Wade said calmly. "But he's not alone." Doc Palmer emerged from his office with an old army rifle, taking aim at another shooter. Jake Morrison appeared from behind the hotel, armed and ready. One by one, the men of Cedar Ridge revealed themselves, all armed, all prepared to stand with their sheriff. Even more surprising, several women had joined them. Helen with her late husband's hunting rifle, Mrs. Henderson with a derringer, Martha Clemens with a shotgun that looked older than the territory itself. "Seems like the odds just got more interesting," Levi observed. Whitman's confident expression began to crack. This wasn't how his plan was supposed to unfold. He'd expected to isolate Levi, to force him into an impossible choice between cooperation and destruction. Instead, he'd united the entire town against him. "You're all making a terrible mistake," Whitman said, his voice losing its smooth control. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "The people I work for can go to hell," interrupted Tommy, appearing beside his grandmother with a slingshot in his small hands. The sight of an 8-year-old boy standing up to armed killers broke something in Whitman's carefully constructed facade. His pale eyes showed genuine fear for the first time. "This ends here," Levi said, taking a step forward. "Call off your men and ride out of town. Don't come back, or what? You'll kill us all. I'll do whatever's necessary to protect my people." The words hung in the morning air like a promise and a threat combined. Whitman looked around at the armed townspeople, at their determined faces, at the complete failure of his carefully laid plans. "This isn't over. Wilde, the people I work for don't give up easily. Then they'll learn what Cedar Ridge is made of." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across 20 feet of dusty street. Then Whitman nodded to his hidden shooters, and one by one they emerged from their positions, weapons lowered. "You've won this round," Whitman said, backing toward his horse. "But there will be others. There always are. The difference is, next time I'll be ready." Whitman mounted his horse and rode out of Cedar Ridge without another word, his hired guns following behind like shadows retreating before the dawn. The town watched them go in silence, weapons still ready, nobody quite believing it was over. It wasn't until the last rider disappeared over the ridge that people began to relax, lowering their guns and looking around at each other with expressions of amazement and relief. "Well," said Wade Hutchins, breaking the silence. "That was interesting." Doc Palmer chuckled, a sound that held 20 years of tension finally being released. "Remind me never to get on this town's bad side." But Levi was looking at Helen, at Tommy, and all the faces surrounding him. People who'd risked everything to stand with a man they'd known for barely a week. People who'd looked past his reputation to see something worth protecting. "Thank you," he said simply. Helen smiled, the same steady expression that had anchored him through the darkest moments of the past week. "Thank us? Levi, you gave us something to believe in again, something worth fighting for." Tommy tugged at his sleeve, grinning up at him with 8-year-old pride. "Did we win, Sheriff Levi?" Levi looked around at Cedar Ridge, at the town that had accepted him, trusted him, stood with him against impossible odds. At the people who'd shown him that ghosts could learn to live again, that redemption was possible even for the lost. The church bell began to ring, calling people to a special service of thanksgiving. Its bronze voice carried across the valley a sound of celebration and community and hope for the future. "Yes, son," Levi said quietly. "We won." The celebration was premature. 3 days after Whitman's departure, the real test began. It started with small things. A broken window at the general store, horses spooked in their corral, supplies mysteriously disappearing from freight wagons. Someone was watching Cedar Ridge, probing for weaknesses. Levi found the first message nailed to the jailhouse door Thursday morning. "The ghost walks among the living." But not for long. The second appeared Friday on the church steps. "Your town harbors a killer. Justice demands payment." By Saturday, the pattern was clear. Whitman hadn't given up, he'd simply changed tactics. Instead of direct confrontation, he was waging a campaign of psychological warfare, trying to turn the town against its sheriff through fear and intimidation, but he'd underestimated Cedar Ridge's resolve. "Let them come," declared Wade Hutchins during Saturday's emergency town meeting. "We stood with you once, Sheriff. We'll stand with you again." The others nodded agreement, their faces showing the kind of determination that had built communities in hostile wilderness. These people had survived Indian raids, drought, disease, and economic collapse. They weren't about to be intimidated by shadows and threatening notes. Still, Levi worried. Whitman's employers, whoever they were, had resources and patience. They could afford to play a long game, wearing down the town's resistance until people began to question whether sheltering the ghost of Shiloh was worth the constant danger. Sunday afternoon brought the answer. Levi was in his office, cleaning weapons and studying maps of the surrounding territory, when Tommy burst through the door. "Sheriff Levi, there's a man in the church. He's got Grandma." Levi was moving before the boy finished speaking, grabbing his rifle and heading for the door. "How many men?" "Just one that I could see. But Sheriff, he's got something wrong with him. Half his face is all burned up." The description sent ice through Levi's veins. He knew only one man who matched that description, a man he'd thought dead for 23 years. Outside the church, Cedar Ridge's main street was eerily quiet. No children playing, no adults going about their Sunday business. Everyone had taken shelter, waiting to see how this new crisis would unfold. The church doors stood open, revealing nothing but shadows within. But Levi could hear a voice echoing from inside, a familiar drawl made harsh by old injuries and older hatred. "That you out there, ghost? Come on in. Let's finish what we started at Milliken's Bend." Levi approached carefully, rifle ready, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. Milliken's Bend, the battle where everything had gone wrong, where Kane's orders had led to the execution of Confederate prisoners, where Levi's testimony had destroyed careers and lives. He'd thought all the witnesses were dead or scattered. Apparently, he'd been wrong. The church interior was dim, lit only by afternoon sunlight filtering through stained glass windows. Helen knelt in the front pew, her hands tied behind her back, her face calm despite the obvious danger. Behind her stood a man Levi recognized from nightmares and court-martial transcripts, Sergeant Major Caleb Thorne, Kane's right-hand man, the one who'd actually carried out the prisoner executions. The left side of his face was a ruin of scar tissue, the result of a Confederate shell that should have killed him. "Surprised to see me, Wilde?" Thorne's voice was a rasp, damaged by the same explosion that had ruined his face. "I've been waiting 23 years for this moment." "Let her go, Thorne." "Your quarrel is with me." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong." Thorne pressed the barrel of his gun against Helen's temple. "My quarrel is with everything you care about. Everyone you've tried to save." Levi stepped farther into the church, his rifle trained on Thorne, but unable to take the shot without risking Helen's life. The man was positioned perfectly, using her as a human shield while maintaining perfect cover behind the heavy wooden pew. "Whitman sent you." "Whitman's a useful fool. But the people who pay his salary, they understand the value of old debts." Thorne's ruined mouth twisted in what might have been a smile. "They've been very patient, Ghost. Very thorough. What do you want?" "What I've always wanted. Justice for those boys you murdered at Milliken's Bend." The church fell silent except for the whisper of wind through broken stonework. Levi could see Helen's face, calm and trusting despite the gun at her head. She believed he would save her, believed the ghost of Shiloh could work one more miracle. But miracles required sacrifice. And Levi was running out of things to sacrifice. "Those prisoners were executed on Kane's orders," he said quietly. "I testified to that truth under oath. You testified to lies. Kane never gave those orders. You made that decision on your own. The same reversal Kane had tried to sell, the same twisted version of events that turned victim into perpetrator. But coming from Thorne, who'd been there, who'd pulled triggers and watched men die, it carried different weight. You were there, Thorne. You know what happened. I know Kane was trying to save those boys. No, he was looking for a way to get them safely behind Confederate lines. But you saw enemy uniforms and you saw red." Levi's mind flashed back to that terrible day, the chaos of battle. The captured prisoners huddled against the church wall. Kane's face twisted with something that might have been anguish or rage. Had it been anguish? Had Kane been trying to save lives instead of end them? 23 years of certainty began to crack like ice on a warming river. "Even if that were true," Levi said carefully, "it doesn't change what happened next. Kane spent decades hunting me for something we both did. Kane went mad with grief. Started believing his own lies." Thorne's finger tightened on the trigger. "But I never forgot the truth. Never stopped knowing who was really responsible." In the silence that followed, Levi heard something that made his blood turn cold, the faint sound of metal sliding against wood. Helen was working at her bonds, trying to free her hands without drawing attention. But Thorne heard it too. His scarred head turned slightly, just enough to see what she was doing. "Clever woman," he said conversationally. "Shame, she has to die for your sins." The gun swung away from Helen's head, aiming instead at her heart. In that instant of movement, Levi had his shot, a narrow window between Thorne's position and Helen's body. Time slowed to honey-thick crawls. Levi could see every detail with crystalline clarity. The dust motes dancing in stained glass light, The way Helen's eyes met his with complete faith, the scarred geography of Thorne's ruined face, the rifle kicked against his shoulder, the shot echoing through the church like divine judgment. Thorne staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, his own gun clattering across wooden floors, but the wound wasn't fatal, and Thorne was already reaching for a backup weapon, the same kind of hideout gun Levi had used against Cain. Helen dove for cover behind the altar as Levi worked his rifle's action, chambering another round. But Thorne was faster, his backup gun coming up with practiced speed. 2 shots fired simultaneously, their echoes blending into a single thunderclap that shook dust from the church's ancient rafters. Levi felt the bullet tear through his side, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a wooden pew. Pain flared white-hot, but his own shot had found its mark. Thorne lay motionless on the floor, his lifelong hatred finally at an end. Levi. Helen was beside him, her hands pressing against the wound in his side, trying to stem the bleeding. Her face was pale but determined, showing the kind of strength that had carried her through 20 years of frontier hardship. "How bad?" he asked, tasting copper. "Bad enough. Doc Palmer's coming. I can hear him outside." True to her word, the doctor burst through the church doors moments later, his medical bag in hand and his face grim with professional focus. Behind him came half the town: Wade Hutchins, Jake Morrison, Tommy with tears streaming down his young face. As Doc Palmer worked to stabilize the wound, Levi found himself staring up at the church's vaulted ceiling, at the play of colored light through stained glass windows. For 23 years, he'd carried guilt and doubt about Milliken's Bend, about the prisoners who died there, about his own role in their execution. Maybe Thorne had been right. Maybe Cain had been trying to save those boys. Maybe the ghost of Shiloh had made a terrible mistake that had haunted 2 decades of nights. But looking around at the faces surrounding him, Helen's steady presence, Tommy's fierce loyalty, the concern of people who'd become family, Levi realized something important. The past was past. What mattered now was what he did with the time he had left, how he used whatever years remained to protect and serve and build, instead of destroy. In his coat pocket, Joseph Little Wolf's medicine bag seemed to pulse with quiet warmth, as if the old medicine man's spirits were offering their approval. The 3rd trial was over. The choice between justice and mercy had been made not through words but through actions, through the decision to save rather than punish, to protect rather than avenge. Tommy appeared at his side, clutching a small wooden harmonica, the same instrument Samuel would have been old enough to play. "Had he lived, found this in the wreckage of your cabin," the boy said quietly. "Thought you might want it back." Levi took the harmonica with shaking hands, running his fingers over wood smoothed by a child's touch 23 years ago. It was scorched but intact, another survivor of the fire that had consumed his past. He raised it to his lips and played a simple melody, a lullaby Mary used to sing, a song about coming home after long journeys through dark places. The notes echoed through the church, carrying hope and healing and the promise of redemption finally earned. The cross was simple but well made, fashioned from pine that had grown in the high country where he'd spent 20 years learning to be alone. He'd carved it during his recovery, working slowly as his wounded side healed, taking time to get the proportions right. It bore a single inscription: Caleb Thorne, lost but found. Doc Palmer had wanted to bury Thorne in the potter's field, the unmarked ground reserved for drifters and unknowns. But Levi had insisted on a proper grave, a proper marker, a proper acknowledgement that even enemies deserve dignity in death. Forgiveness isn't just for the living, he'd told the doctor. Sometimes it's for the dead too. Now he knelt beside the fresh grave, pressing the cross into the earth with hands that had learned to create as well as destroy. The wood was smooth as silk, worn by hours of careful handling, marked with the kind of love that came from understanding loss. "Don't know if you can hear me, Thorne," he said quietly. "But if you can, I want you to know I understand why you did what you did. A man's got to believe in something, even if that something is wrong. The wind stirred the cemetery grass, carrying the scent of sage and distant snow. Somewhere among the headstones, a meadowlark sang its liquid song, a sound that spoke of wild places and untamed beauty. But Levi wasn't thinking about wild places anymore. His attention was focused on the town, spread out below the hillside cemetery, on the lights beginning to come on in windows as evening approached. His town now, in ways that went deeper than badges or official appointments. "You coming down from there any time soon?" Ellen's voice came from behind him, warm with affection and gentle teasing. She climbed the hill, carrying a basket that smelled of fresh bread and coffee. "Probably worried that he'd been brooding up here too long. Just finishing up," he said, getting to his feet with only a slight wince from his healing wound. She handed him a cup of coffee and settled beside him on the stone bench someone had placed among the graves years ago. Below them, Cedar Ridge went about its evening business. Children called in for supper, shopkeepers closing their stores, the normal rhythms of a community at peace. "Any regrets?" Ellen asked. Levi considered the question, thinking about the choices that had brought him to this hillside, to this moment, to this woman whose steady presence had become the anchor of his new life. About Thorn. "No, he made his choice, same as I made mine. That's not what I meant. He knew what she meant. The offer he'd received last week, delivered by a federal marshal who'd ridden out from the territorial capital specifically to see him. An appointment as a special investigator working directly for the Justice Department, tracking down the kind of corruption that had created men like Whitman. Good. Pay, respectability, a chance to use his skills in service of something larger than himself. He turned it down without hesitation. "No regrets," he said firmly. "This is where I belong." Helen smiled, the kind of expression that lit up her whole face and reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her steady strength. "Tommy will be pleased. He's been worried you might decide to leave. Where would I go? This is home." The word still felt strange in his mouth after 23 years of exile. But it was true in ways that went deeper than geography or legal residence. Cedar Ridge had accepted him, trusted him, stood with him when the shadows of his past had come calling. More than that, it had given him a chance to be something other than the ghost of Shiloh. Here he was just Levi Wilde, sheriff and neighbor and friend. A man with a past, certainly, but not a man defined by that past. "Speaking of Tommy," Helen said, "he wants to know if you'll teach him to track. Says a deputy sheriff ought to know how to follow a trail." "Deputy sheriff?" "His idea, not mine. He figures in 10 years or so, Cedar Ridge will need 2 lawmen. Helen's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Course, that assumes you'll still be wearing the badge in 10 years. Levi looked down at the silver star pinned to his vest, thinking about what it represented. Not just authority or responsibility, but belonging, purpose, the chance to protect instead of destroy, to build instead of tear down. "I expect I will be." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun touched the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. Below them, the town settled into evening. Lamps lit in windows, smoke rising from chimneys, the quiet contentment of people who'd found a place worth staying. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," Helen said eventually. "What's that?" "The harmonica. Tommy said it belonged to your son." Levi reached into his pocket, finding the small wooden instrument by touch. He'd been carrying it everywhere since the day Tommy returned it, a talisman against the darkness of memory. Samuel made it himself, carved it from a piece of apple wood, spent weeks getting the holes just right. He pulled it out, running his thumb over the smooth surface. "He was going to play me a song for my birthday. Never got the chance. Maybe it's time." Levi looked at her, seeing the gentle encouragement in her eyes. "I wouldn't know what to play." "Doesn't matter. It's not about the music. It's about letting go." He raised the harmonica to his lips, thinking of an 8-year-old boy with gap teeth and his father's stubborn streak. The notes that came were simple, halting at first, but growing stronger as muscle memory returned. It was the lullaby Mary used to sing, the one about coming home after long journeys through dark places. But as he played, Other melodies joined in, fragments of songs he'd heard around campfires during the war, hymns from Cedar Ridge's church services, the wordless music of wind through mountain pines. The harmonica sang of loss and redemption, of guilt transformed into purpose, of ghosts learning to live again. It sang of a man who'd spent 20 years running from himself and had finally found the courage to stop. When the last note faded into the evening air, Helen was smiling through tears. That was beautiful. It was Samuel's song, his gift to his old man. No, she said quietly. That was your song, Levi, the song of a man who's finally come home. As they walked back down the hill toward town, Levi found himself thinking about Joseph Little Wolf's prophecy. 3 trials, facing his past, protecting his new family, choosing between justice and mercy, all completed, all survived, all transformed into something greater than the sum of their individual challenges. The medicine bag in his pocket no longer felt like a burden, but like a blessing, a connection to wisdom older than his own pain, deeper than his own understanding. The Cheyenne had taught him to survive in the wilderness, but Cedar Ridge had taught him something more important. It had taught him to live. Behind them, the cemetery settled into darkness, its headstones standing sentinel over the town's history. Among them, 3 new graves bore witness to the price of redemption. Cain with his twisted dreams of honor, Morrison with his soldier's pride, Thorne with his lifetime of hatred. All of them had been trapped by the past, unable to see beyond the wounds that had shaped them. But their deaths had served a purpose, had cleared the way for something better to take root in the ground they'd watered with blood. At the bottom of the hill, Tommy was waiting for them, bouncing with 8-year-old energy despite the late hour. Sheriff Levi. "Grandma, come see what I built." He led them to the vacant lot beside the general store, where he'd constructed an elaborate fort from scrap lumber and boundless imagination. It was the kind of project that spoke of a boy who felt safe enough to dream, secure enough to build something permanent. "It's got everything," Tommy explained proudly. "Watchtowers, secret passages, even a jail for outlaws. Want to see inside?" As they crawled through the fort's narrow entrance, following Tommy's enthusiastic tour, Levi felt something he hadn't experienced in 23 years. Simple, uncomplicated joy. The pleasure of a man playing with a child who trusted him completely, who saw him not as a killer or a ghost, but as a friend worth sharing adventures with. Later, after Tommy had been called in for bed and Helen had returned to her store, Levi made one final round of the town. It was a ritual he'd developed over the past weeks, checking doors and windows, making sure everything was secure for the night. But it was more than just professional duty. It was the satisfaction of a man protecting something he'd helped to build, something he'd earned the right to call his own. Cedar Ridge slept peacefully under the stars, its people safe behind doors and windows that no longer needed to fear what might come calling in the darkness. The ghost of Shiloh had become something else entirely, a guardian, a protector, a man who'd found his way back from the wilderness of guilt and regret. On his way back to the jail, Levi stopped at the new wooden cross he'd carved for Thorne's grave. In the moonlight, it looked almost luminous, a pale beacon in the darkness of the cemetery. "Rest easy, old enemy," he said quietly. "Your war is over." Then he walked home through streets that knew his name and trusted his protection, carrying Samuel's harmonica and Helen's love and the quiet contentment of a man who'd finally learned the difference between surviving and living. Above the mountains, the full moon cast silver light on new beginnings and old promises kept. The ghost of Shiloh was gone, buried in the ashes of a burned cabin and the graves of old hatreds. What remained was Levi Wilde, sheriff, protector, and friend. A man who'd come home at last,